Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a review on the 2004 animated film Home on the Range. Yeehaw! Now, if you haven't seen the movie, you're going to expect major spoilers ahead. So there's your warning. Anyways, let's get on with the review. Now, Home on the Range is about a trio of dairy cows who are on a journey to catch a cattle rustler named Alameda Slim. That no good varmint. Anyways, the first cow we get introduced to is Maggie. She's a lovely brown and tan Hereford cow, and she is voiced by the now controversial Roseanne Barr. But if a remake was released, I think she'd be voiced by Jamie Lee Curtis, who happens to be the one and only Laura Strode.
What's the boogeyman?
Oh, right! To call you stupid would be an insult to stupid people!
She tells the story of how Abner's herd got stolen and she was the only one left. And Abner is gone with her to take Maggie to a brand new home, which happens to be a lovely dairy farm known as Patch of Heaven. At Patch of Heaven, owned by Pearl Gesner, it's a booming business with two lovely cows, one named Grace and another named Mrs. Calloway. Grace is voiced by the beautiful Jennifer Tillett of Family Guy and Bride of Chucky, while Mrs. Calloway is voiced by Dame Judi Dench of James Bond fame. After K.D. Lang's song Patch of Heaven, we hear an argument between three piglets and a goat named Jeb, voiced by Joe Flaherty. In a remake, he'd be voiced by the one and only Robert Englund of A Nightmare on Elm Street and Stranger Things fame. Anyways, Grace decides to intervene. As Grace intervenes, the piglets said that Jeb took the can and he says it's his. Jeb does have a point, though, because he says,
"You don't get this whole farm concept, do you, sister?"
This forces the piglets to get into a wrestling match with Jeb. Then, Mrs. Calloway breaks it up, like the tough gal she is. Jeb is being kinda sarcastic, by the way. As Maggie arrives at Patch of Heaven, she's introduced by Pearl, and Audrey runs over to Mrs. Calloway to let Mrs. Calloway know that Maggie has arrived. Then, Maggie arrives with brilliant fanfare. She's a show cow, and she knows it. She then introduces herself. One piglet says that she's the biggest cow he's ever seen, and Maggie ends up joking around with him. Then, Maggie decides to do magic tricks with the piglets. Meanwhile, a horse named Buck, voiced by the one and only Cuba Gooding Jr. of Jerry Maguire fame, stops by the farm to drop off a note that states that the farm will be auctioned off in 3 days, and they need $750 to pay back in order to save it. This causes Maggie to hatch a plan in order to save the farm. Then, after much negotiation, Maggie heads off with Grace, while Mrs. Calloway initially decides to stay behind. But after the chicks end up buttering her up, she changes her mind. Then, the three cows are off. Then, as the cows approach Chugwater, Grace ends up singing, because she loves to sing. What a sweet little gal. Then Maggie and Mrs. Calloway notice a couple of vultures circling overhead. Maggie tells them that Grace ain't dying, and that she'll keep them posted. Then the vultures just go along their merry old way. Meanwhile, Buck is daydreaming, and we are introduced to his canine companion, Rusty, a basset hound. Then Buck is notified that a bounty hunter named Rico, voiced by Charles Dennis, is on his way to town, and he caught Evil Eye Joe. Buck says that he wants to live his dream riding with Rico and kicking some bad guy butt. Then, as the cows make it to Chugwater, they see that the town is surprisingly quiet, like the farm at milking time. Then, a firecracker goes off, which the cows mistake for a gunfight. They go into a saloon and have a big fight. The cows end up getting pushed out by the saloon owner, Annie. Then, they end up meeting with Buck. Then, Rico arrives. He sounds almost like Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. Then, Rico is notified of a bounty on Alameda Slim for $750, which is exactly the price the cows need to save the farm. Maggie comes up with an idea. She's like, I got it. We'll go and have that Alameda Slim and use the reward money to save the farm. Mrs. Calloway is like, nope, we're gonna go back. Maggie's like, I beg to differ. They really got off on the wrong hoof, by the way. Then Maggie and Mrs. Calloway end up getting into a mud fight, which ends up becoming mud wrestling, as Rassie put it. Soon enough, the sheriff breaks up this fight. Then the cows are off on their way to a cattle drive, which happens to be at night. But before they make it there, Grace is singing, which happens to be somewhat grating to Maggie and Mrs. Calloway. Then the cows notice that there's a farm auction, and it's on none other than Maggie's old home. Then, to answer Grace, she says Alameda Slim happened. Then, after a brief sequence that could get some viewers with epilepsy, we hear the sheriff say, sold Mr. Yancey Odell. This happens to be Alameda Slim in disguise. Then, once they make it to the cattle drive, the girls end up trying to be careful around it. But then, two longhorn bulls named Barry and Bob wake up, both voiced by Mark Walton, who happens to be the same voice of Rhino the hamster from Bolt. Then, Grace tells them that they're looking for a cattle rustler named Alameda Slim. Then, Bob's like, Slim? Ha ha! Wow, Slim's just an old scary bedtime story to get little calves to behave. Suddenly, Slim and the Willies arrive. Then, Mrs. Calloway gives Barry a quick "Sure you can!" After that, surprise, surprise, it's Alameda Slim, voiced by Randy Quaid. Maggie stares him down, and she's like, it's payback time. Cover me! Grace doesn't understand. Then, it's revealed that Alameda Slim has a secret weapon. He yodels to get the cattle hypnotized and end up getting them in a trance. This ends up catching not only Maggie, but Mrs. Calloway. Fortunately, Grace and the bison, whose name was revealed to be Junior, are not affected. Then, Rico and Buck arrive to settle the matter. And Rico goes off with his own horse, Patrick, voiced by Patrick Warburton, aka Joe Swanson from Family Guy. Maggie has a quick lecture with Buck. Mrs. Calloway wants to stop all this, and Maggie goes off with her. But Grace can tell otherwise, and she soothes him with some sweet talk. Then, he's like, I wouldn't help you bossy bovines if my life depended on it. Then, Grace decides to go off. Bye. Then, as the cows go off, Buck runs off, and he's like, out of my way, cows. Then, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway are off on their way. Then, Alameda Slim and the Willie Brothers gang find out that Patch of Heaven is up for auction. And he says, every acre counts. Then, a sign goes up saying that Patch of Heaven is going up on auction. After that, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway end up following Buck. But Buck messes up the trails just to set Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway off their course. Then, a flash flood hits, and Mrs. Calloway goes to save Maggie as Maggie ends up almost drowning. As they take high ground, Maggie says they can't give up, but Mrs. Calloway is like, nope, that's enough, Maggie. We're going back home the minute this lets up. But, no buts, Maggie. We're going home. Maggie thinks Mrs. Calloway might be right. Then, when Maggie and Mrs. Calloway get up after the flash flood, it was revealed that Maggie was dreaming. Then, Grace ends up startling them, kind of. Hi there. Boy, am I glad you guys are up. And she reveals some food for the three. And after that, we're introduced to a jackrabbit with a peg leg named Lucky Jack. And Lucky is part of his name, apparently. And how did he get his name? The peg leg. He reveals that he used to have a home too, Echo Mine. Then, he finds out that there still is a wanted poster for Alameda Slim. Maggie soon realizes her own plan. Maggie and Mrs. Calloway make a deal. If they catch Slim and save the farm, Maggie will leave. But Mrs. Calloway's gonna change her mind soon. Meanwhile, at Echo Mine, a train arrives with Mr. Wesley, the big man in Black Market Livestock, voiced by the one and only Randall Boggs, Steve Buscemi. Then, we see Buck trying to get into Echo Mine, but Junior tells him cows only. Buck tries to tell that bison that he doesn't understand, but the bison turns the tables on Buck and says that Buck doesn't understand. Then, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway arrive. Junior is keen to oblige, and he's like, right this way, Ugly. Tell him Junior sent ya. In an homage to A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, released in 1988. Then Maggie, Grace, Mrs. Calloway, and Lucky Jack all go into Echo Mine. Then Maggie ends up giving a distraction to Slim, and they all give chase. This is caused by Junior chasing Buck. And this is a big chase at Echo Mine. Then, boom! Dynamite goes off in the mine. Then, the train crashes. Then, it was revealed that Rico was working for Slim all along. And Buck's like,
Judas! No!
Then, Maggie, Grace, Mrs. Calloway, and Lucky Jack all fight off Slim, the Willies, Rico, and Wesley. But Slim ends up playing the coup. Then, when all hope is lost, Mrs. Calloway saves the day with her own bright idea. We're gonna take this train! Then, the cows end up going on the train, and driving it, nonetheless. Then, the cows drive the train, and Buck lets all the Longhorns out. And Barry and Bob, those two Longhorns from earlier, try keeping up with the train, but they slam into a post. Then, there's a switch up ahead, and the Morning Express is coming right toward them. Lucky Jack ends up using his own leg as the switch. The train goes by the Morning Express. Roadhogs! Then, the sheriff announces sold. But just as Slim is about to sign the deed that'll guarantee that the farm is his, the train ends up crashing onto the farm. Then, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway get off the train, and it's a reference to the good, the bad, and the ugly. Then, the cows end up starting to fight, but Slim's like, hold it right there, when he pulls out the gun. Then, Jeb gets his own idea. Piggies, it's time to open up a can of whooping! Then, Jeb and the piglets hurl tin cans at Slim, and the chicks end up tickling him, and one of them crows in his ear, causing him to fall in the mud. Then, the hens peck all over Slim. Then, Slim's catapulted into the train's tunnel. Mrs. Calloway then blows a whistle, revealing that Mr. Yancey Odell was really, indeed, Alameda Slim in disguise. But Slim tries to do his yodeling and it ends up getting Maggie and Mrs. C. But Maggie's not done yet when she throws her cowbell. Grace ends up getting the perfect opportunity to strike. And with one swift kick, she hurls that cowbell into Slim's mouth, silencing him. Then Alameda Slim is arrested. Nobody messes with pearls, girls. Then Buck arrives. Say, girls, got milk? Then Slim's sent off to prison, and Pearl is given the $750 to save the farm. Then Maggie fakes that she left. Then when Mrs. Calloway says, right down to her appalling bodily eruptions, Maggie burps right by her. And Maggie really was at the farm. And Maggie decides to stay. And Mrs. Calloway ends up letting her stay after all. Then all the farm animals are with Pearl, and a photo is taken, and they're on the front page of the newspaper. Then, Lucky Jack is reading the newspaper. Then Jeb chews out of it. And he's like, hey, dangnabbit, Jeb, how many times have I got to tell you to wait your turn? And Jeb retorts with, how many times have I told you to get out of my barrel? Then Jeb and Jack get into a tussle. And Andre's like, oh, it's so nice that Jeb finally found a friend. And the farm was already fixed, and the cows come back from the state fair, and they won first prize. In fact, all the animals won first prize. Then, along come Bob and Bear, and those two Longhorns are like, hey Bear, 3 queens, 2 kings, full house. And who else should arrive but, surprise, surprise, it's Junior. And the Joker is wild. Oh, yeah. And so, happy ending. Patch of Heaven is saved, and it becomes a prize-winning dairy farm. And as a gift of generosity, Mrs. Calloway gives her hat to Maggie. And that's Home on the Range. And what can I say? It's one of my top 5 favorite movies of all time. I give this movie an A+. It's one of Disney's better movies, despite the negative critical response. I'm going to say this movie is worth a watch. This movie had a lot of humor, and it had a lot of fun performances from a lot of talented actors. Everything about this movie is a pro. I've loved this movie a lot since I was a kid. Anyways, my favorite part from this movie is when Mrs. Calloway gave her hat to Maggie. Anyways, this review was done in honor of the 19th anniversary of Home on the Range. And I have a few videos of Home on the Range movie impressions. And anyways, that's going to wrap it up for me. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later. Until next time. It's been Bard, signing off. Bye!